Hola, ¿qué tal? Soy Matías Rebolledo y seguimos aquí en la 69 edición de la Semana Internacional de Cine de Valladolid, esta Semincia en las tripas del Calderón, donde desde Quinótico estamos contando todo lo que ocurre en el festival, como siempre, con lo mejor del talento nacional e internacional. Hoy llegamos a esa segunda parte, la del talento internacional. Tenemos con nosotros a Constance Tsang, directora de Blues and Palace. Welcome. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Hi, Matthias. I'm doing well.
We were talking just before the interview about how was the projection with people. I imagine you've seen it before with an audiences, but how was that? How did you perceive like people in the room?
I often think that when I'm watching the film with an audience, or at least like the first couple of screenings, I was so concerned about the film that I made that I must say that I wasn't like particularly looking at the audience reactions, but I do definitely pick up and observe when they're laughing or when I see people crying, and like those are the sort of like big emotions that I think are most apparent to me when I'm in the screening room. But really especially with the first couple of screenings, there were a lot of nerves involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that the very first question is a little bit obvious, but I wanted to ask you, how did you come up with the film, with the idea for the film?
Yeah, so a lot of the story is rooted in personal experiences. The story itself is set in the Chinese communities of New York, predominantly Flushing, Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in Flushing. And I feel like a lot of what I saw through not just the community involved, but like through the livelihood of my family, of my parents, that definitely shaped, I think, how I came to the story. And so much of, I think, the themes, including grief and connection, all of that are themes that I'm constantly trying to understand myself. So a mixture of things, right? A mixture of the world that I observe and the world that's very interior to me.
I wanted to ask you about the research process in terms of getting to know the actresses, for example, getting to find them. So how was that? How did you find the right choice for them to play the characters?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like with actors and trying to find the right fit for the characters, a lot of the time it has to do with characters or actors, I should say, that feel very close to the characters that I had written. And I think that's one of the biggest part about the casting process itself, that it has a lot to do with how closely related are the sort of like natural characteristics of these humans, and how does it align with the characters I have written. And I think that process was really through a lot of conversation. It was through me understanding their previous work as well, the way that they moved, their presence, and of course, like the sort of ineffable, right? Like, how am I in a room with them, and how kind of like tangible and touchable can they be, and how responsive are they to this specific character that I had written? So a lot of conversation and a lot of like natural instinct.
In a way, we can define Blues and Palace as a history of violence, of the migrant experience. I know it's economic violence, physical violence, sexual violence. So I wanted to ask you about that. Did you were interested in portraying that migrant experience from a violence point of view in a way?
I think that has a lot to do with sort of the worldview that of course I have, that I sort of imbued into this film. And I think the violence itself, it exists on a level that is almost very mundane. You know, a lot of the sort of day-to-day livelihood of, I think, the women and also the men, the sort of labor that they carry, and the violence itself, yes, on the one hand, exists in a sort of physical environment, but there's also the internal violence, right? The internal violence of what does it feel like to not be able to fully express a dream, to not be able to fully say or exhibit what they're feeling. So that's a great question. The sort of like violence that is in the world and also inside of them.
You just mentioned the dream. I wanted to ask you about this shattered American dream.
Sure.
So it is curious how you depict this massage center as sort of an inside world
Yeah.
It's not open to. It's open to white dudes who are there for for fetishization reasons, but it's not connected to the rest of the world. We never see like the streets, or we never see like the city even. So
Yes.
I get that it was intentional, but how did you find that inside world which the film happens?
Absolutely. I think that question also ties back to, again, observation and also how I experienced and understood this particular community. I think so much of even seeing my parents' day-to-day lives, it was very insular. And I think that sort of the world that is without the streets, like without these sort of markers of it being, for example, New York City. Like a lot of the times people bring this up to me, like why show all of these interior spaces? And I really wanted to create a feeling that this was a space that they created for themselves, that it was hard for them to access a world that is more known to us. You know what I mean? That for them, the space that they created was a space of course, a sense of insular quality, but also that it became in another word, also a safe space for them to find kinship and friendship. So yeah, I would say that the bubble is something that can exist not just for this particular group of people that I'm showing, but I think the way that the Chinese community exists in also other countries is very similar to that. How do you create a sense of like family and community when you're so far from home?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that in terms of cinema, because in Spain we do have a problem. I am a first-generation immigrant. I have a sister who was born here, but in terms of comparison with United States, France, England, even Belgium, we do not have a cinema of the migrant experience. There are no directors who are reaching the scale of the stories to be able to tell them. So what can we do? How can we solve that problem, besides giving them money to them to make movies?
That is a really great question. I feel very ill-equipped to answer that for you, but I can say that I think for myself, and also because America is comprised of so many immigrants, of course it's easier for us to have a conversation and a sort of cinema that is rooted in that, right? At least for the sort of contemporary American cinema that I see that's happening around. And I would say that for things to change, for the needle to move forward, I think opportunities are incredibly important. I think also the way that I think immigrant cinema or stories like that can exist, I think it has a lot to do with the way that the country looks for these stories as well, right? It's sort of, it needs to exist on a bigger sort of scale. And I think artists and creators have to understand that that sort of story is privileged. So I think it needs to happen sort of big and also, of course, from the South, because it's very hard to make a movie. And I think without sort of like a support system, it's just very hard.
Well, speaking about that, this is your first long feature,
Yes.
but I wanted to ask you about the production process. I know it was difficult, but how difficult was it?
Difficult. It was very, very difficult. I mean, the story itself, I had taken a process of over, not for the entire time, but over a process of like 5 years to write. And I think finding money is very, very hard. I think or I guess I should say, when you're making a film for the first time, no one's just gonna hand it to you, right? So there's a lot of willpower that's involved. And also there's a lot of collaboration from the crew, from my producers, from my actors. Like there is a complete involvement of this sort of film community. So I would not have this film without my incredible team and without my incredible collaborators.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. This is the last question about the mixing of cinematography with editing, which lead us to extraordinary scenes. I won't spoil anything, but there's that ending. I think it's very beautiful and sad in a way, but it's extraordinary. So I wanted to ask you about that mix and finding the right visual tone for the film.
The right visual tone. I think a lot of the tone and the atmosphere starts from the script. So the way that I had like written scene descriptions, the pacing of it, all of that is very evident, I think, from script stage. And I would say that the cinematography and also the editing, a lot of it was for my collaborators to also understand what I was trying to go for. So in the conversations as I was working with Norm, my DP, and Caitlin, my editor, we wanted to make sure that whatever we were doing, it was always tied to this greater vision. And of course, like making choices that were amplifying, I think, my own character choices. So everything is tied to the script and also tied to character.
Well, Constance, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Matías.
Let's hope the best for the film, que va a estrenarse en España de la mano de Atalante. Y nosotros seguimos aquí en Quinótico, en el set del Calderón. Para todo lo demás, ya sabéis, quinótico.es, la primera con K, la segunda con C.